or where we ended up in our study was in Isaiah chapter 20, and we had gotten down through verse 4 or to verse 5. This chapter, having 6 verses, I titled it, Symbol of Assyrian Victory over Egypt and Ethiopia. And I mentioned as we entered this that Sargon's name was not found in ancient literature, and thus the mention of Sargon's name in this chapter, critics said, was one of the Bible's mistakes. But in 1842, a man named Botta, B-O-T-T-A, discovered the ruins of Sargon's palace. And in the inscriptions and all of the information that he found, it showed that Sargon was one of Assyria's greatest kings, even though he had been kind of disappeared from the scene as far as history is concerned, except the one mention of his name here in Isaiah chapter 20. And so the Bible, as is always the case, is proven to be correct. Tartan, in verse 1, was in all probability an office or a title much like commander-in-chief, probably in second position in the empire. He fought against Ashdod, took it. Ashdod, being one of the 5 chief cities of the Philistines, or sometimes one of the 5 capital cities of the Philistines. It's mentioned that way as well. It was a highly fortified city, but Sargon or Tartan took it while Sargon is king. In verse 2 then, Isaiah is instructed to remove his outer garment. He would have left on the inner garment, thus he was not totally without clothing. But it is referred to as he was going to be walking naked and barefoot. And there's some good lessons we talked about last time about that, but it was going to be for a 3-year period. And it was a sign upon Egypt and Ethiopia, we're told. And that's what Assyria is going to do to them within that 3-year time frame. In verse 4 then, the king of Assyria led the Egyptian prisoners and the Ethiopian captives, both young and old, led them away in the most humiliating fashion that could be done, which was the symbol that Isaiah was setting forth in going naked for 3 years. So that brings us to verse 5. And they shall be afraid and ashamed of Ethiopia, their expectation, and of Egypt, their glory. This is now that they have sought and they trusted in these nations of Egypt and Ethiopia. But in reality, all of that was folly, foolishness. Those nations could not help them because they had forsaken God. And thus, no amount of military strength could help them. But certainly not these two nations that were going to fall to the Assyrian Empire anyway. And so going down to those nations and trusting in them is going to bring shame upon Israel. Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown in their commentary states that Ethiopia was their expectation, for the Philistine had not yet obtained, but hoped for alliance with it. Egypt was their glory, that is, boast, Isaiah 13 and verse 19, for the alliance with it was complete. So there they are, glorying, boasting an alliance with these nations that would bring them shame. In verse 6 then, that the inhabitant of this isle shall say in that day, behold, such is our expectation, whither we flee for help to be delivered from the king of Assyria, and how shall we escape? The inhabitant of the isle would be the coast of the Mediterranean, but probably represents all of Palestine. If you recall, the geographical layout, you have basically the northern part coming down where Palestine would be with the Mediterranean Sea, and then as you come back on down around, you have Egypt and Ethiopia. So the coast of the Mediterranean Sea probably represents all of that Palestinian area. It would be a small strip compared to Egypt and Ethiopia, even if you're taking all of Palestine. If they sought help, thus, from Egypt and Ethiopia, they would be sadly disappointed. They're not going to escape. They would be overcome. And again, if those strong nations, Egypt and Ethiopia, were overcome, then how shall we, that's Judah, escape? If a nation is able to defeat a strong nation and you're part of a nation that's not nearly as strong as they are, what does that tell you about your chances against them? Not too good, is it? That's when you send ambassadors and seek for peace. Wayne Jackson noted concerning this that though the weakness of Egypt was certainly revealed during the time of Sargon's invasion, the ultimate fulfillment of this prophecy came in the time of Esarhaddon, 670 BC, and Ashurbanipal in 667 BC, who conquered Egypt and carried off its treasures and appointed satraps over the provinces. Had to stop and think about how you pronounce that. So that would be the time of the fulfillment of this taking place. Time of Esarhaddon and the time of Ashurbanipal. And so now then, chapter 21. In the first 10 verses of this chapter, we have there the fall of Babylon. Verse 1 says that the burden of the desert of the sea, as whirlwinds in the south pass through, so it cometh from the desert, from a terrible land. Babylon is being referred to here as the desert or the wilderness of the sea. Darrell Conley points out regarding this description that evidently because of the terrain in which it was located, Babylon was built on a broad, undulating plain without cultivation or even any trees. This plain was often flooded by the Euphrates. So a wilderness of the sea. Wayne Jackson adds that due to the fact that lakes and marshes dominate the region of the Euphrates River, that would be why it was referred to as the desert of the sea. And even though this would be a small aspect of inspiration, the Bible is always right in its geographical references. Kind of amazing how accurate the Bible is. Well, not really, because the author of it is God, who knows all things. But if you take away inspiration, then the accuracy even of things like unto this, the burden of the desert of the sea, small things like this, you wouldn't always get right. There'd be mistakes in it. And the Bible's without those. That's a sign of inspiration. Whirlwinds come up from the south, the deserts of Arabia to Babylon. So as whirlwinds in the south pass through. So they would be coming from if you remember again the layout of the land, you have Palestine, then the Jordan River, then you have Transjordan, but then over next to that you have the Arabian Desert. And Babylon would be northeast of that Arabian Desert. So the whirlwinds from the Arabian Desert coming through Babylon. The Medes and the Persians, who are going to be the nation that defeats Babylon, would not come from the south, though, and yet you have this as a reference. It's whirlwinds in the south pass through, so it cometh from the desert, from a terrible land. Notice the word as. A little word, but great significance. What does as indicate? It's something that is taking place that is similar to this. So here you have these desert storms, whirlwinds from the desert coming from the south. It's not saying that this nation that's going to destroy Babylon is coming from the south, but it's going to be likened to that. It's similar in nature to that. So in verse 2, we have that a grievous vision is declared unto me. The treacherous dealer dealeth treacherously, and the spoiler spoileth. Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media, all the sighings thereof have I made to cease. Kind of an interesting verse, isn't it? It is a grievous burden that he's dealing with here. A grievous vision declared unto me. Why is it so grievous? Because it was the calamity of it was so great. And Babylon is not going to be conquered by force, by arms, but by strategy. And thus dealeth treacherously. It's not going to be by strength, but by treachery. Darrell Conley points out that the Persians were inside the walls and in control of the city before the Babylonians knew what was happening or what had happened. Herodotus, in his history, tells how Cyrus at night, most of the preliminary work having been done earlier, diverted the river that flowed through Babylon into a new bed that bypassed the city. A group of his soldiers then entered the city through the empty riverbed and opened the gates to his army. Herodotus tells how the perimeter of the city was practically deserted because of the riotous banquet being held in the center of the city at the palace. The city had fallen, and those in charge did not know it.
Do you have any specificity about how they made the river? They dig the ground up and make the river go somewhere else? So
they diverted the water.
Wow.
Can be done many ways. A dam, just a way in which to divert it. Not even dam it up. And that's really what they did. They just diverted it a different way so that it didn't go through the city. It made it where the riverbed was dry and his army could go in.
Well, that must have been pretty good technicians to do that without much noise.
As to them being technicians, who knows? I mean, it's dealing treacherously with them. That's why, and that's what Isaiah is prophesying. It's not done by strength of arms. It's not done by warfare in that way, but by dealing treacherously. And they spoil the city as a result. Now then, the riotous banqueting that was taking place in the middle of the city, well, guess what that was? And we're told about it. Okay, I finally got the the writing on the wall in Daniel the 5th chapter. Belteshazzar's feast. And there's the writing on the wall, the finger that writes on the wall, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin.
But when you tie all that in with Jeremiah 50 and 51, you get a big panorama and show you a whole bunch of stuff to you.
The meaning of that was, thou hast been weighed in the balances and found wanting. You're basically your city is being divided and will be given to the Medo-Persian Empire. I think there's been a whole lot of sermons preached on that through the years. It's if we weigh our actions, will we be found wanting? Now then, Belteshazzar, in this riotous feast, nobody could read, of course, the writing, and finally they got Daniel to come, and he was going to bestow all these riches upon Daniel because he read the writing on the wall. Only thing is, that night his city was gone for his sake. It had fallen without his knowledge. Isaiah in this verse, though, also tells us who's going to do it. Elam and Media. We refer to it as the Medo-Persian Empire. Here, Persia, or Media would be the Medo, or Media, the nation. But we refer to it as the Medo-Persian Empire, whereas here it has Elam. Elam was a province of Persia. So it's a small, I guess we would liken it to a state in Persia. Jamieson Fawcett Brown mentioned, quote, the name Persia was not in use until the captivity. It means a horseman. Cyrus first trained the Persians in horsemanship. It is a mark of authenticity that the name is not found before Daniel and Ezekiel. Now here's Isaiah using the name Elam instead of Persia because Persia wasn't in use at that time. I'm trying to think of a modern day illustration of that. And I can't think of one. Probably some of those nations that broke off from Russia would be a good illustration. Before Russia broke up and divided into those nations broke off from them, they were part of Russia. And to have used a term today of that nation back before that time would have been meaningless. Well, that's what you have here. Isaiah doesn't use Persia because it wasn't in use. Nobody would have had any, it would have had no meaning to anyone. But to use Elam, which was a province of Persia, gets the aspect of it's going to be that nation, but he uses a term that is within the time frame that he's writing. Again, one of those small details in the Bible that shows accuracy. Let me also just kind of add this. The modernists of our day, they deny biblical inspiration and reality. Part of that which they must do because of denial of inspiration and thus predictive prophecy is to redate the books. For example, Daniel was not written by Daniel when we know of it. It was written by someone else who ascribed the name Daniel to it, but it was written during the 2nd century BC. That's when all of those events that Daniel prophesied would have already taken place. And that way they can deny the inspiration of the Bible and predictive prophecy. They've done the same thing with Isaiah. Isaiah wasn't written when we have the dating of Isaiah. It was written a long time after the fact. Well, if it was written years after the fact, when Persia was known as Persia, then this is one of the problems that they would have, because why did he use Elam? Why wouldn't he use Persia? Elam shows a time prior to Cyrus, which is when Isaiah wrote. Actually wrote about 150 years prior to Cyrus. If it was written hundreds of years later, that person who was writing it would have used Persia, not Elam.
The one place is good. It was a city. It used to be Constantinople. Is now Istanbul.
There,
Back at that time, it was Constantinople.
right now, then it's Istanbul. Leningrad would be another one. That is now St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg is,
Or is it?
Leningrad, then back to St. Petersburg.
Yeah. Okay, it's jumped back and forth. St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and then St. Petersburg again.
I found out quick over there you didn't call it Leningrad anymore.
That's a no-no. Yeah. But if you were writing at that time when it was Leningrad, what would you have used? You would have used Leningrad and not St. Petersburg. Today you'd use St. Petersburg, wouldn't you?
Or in the time of St. Peter, you'd call it.
Yeah.
Peter the Great, you'd call it.
Peter the Great. Pulpit commentary stated that the discovery that Cyrus, at the time of his conquest of Babylon, bore the title King of Ansan, not King of Persia, coupled with the probability that Ansan was a part of Elam, leads a particular interest to those words. Isaiah could not describe Cyrus as king of Persia and at the same time be intelligible to his contemporaries, since Persia was a country utterly unknown to them. And using the term Elam instead, he uses that of a country known to the Hebrews. Genesis 14 verse 1 he references. Adjoining Persia, and at the time of his expedition against Babylon, subject to Cyrus. So they were just pointing out basically what we've been discussing, that there's the name Why didn't they use Persia? Well, it wasn't used then. So God is going to, though, bring an end to the sighings caused by the Babylonians to the nations and the captives. Someone read Isaiah 14 and verses 7 and verse 8.
The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing, yea, the first tree rejoice at thee, and the cedars of Lebanon saying, since thou art laid down, no pillar is come up against us.
Okay. The whole earth is at rest. The sighings have I made to cease, God says. Why? The whole earth is at rest. God has destroyed this great nation. In verse 3 then, Andrew, if you'll move that to verse 3. He says, therefore are my loins filled with pain. Pangs have taken hold of me, as the pangs of a woman that travaileth. I was bowed down at the hearing of it. I was dismayed at the seeing of it. Isaiah is moved. You can almost say horror-struck at the devastation, the carnage of Babylon. This is similar to what we read in Isaiah 13 and verse 8. And they shall be afraid, pains and sorrows shall take hold of them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth. They shall be amazed at one at another. Their faces shall be as flames. So here's the suffering that is mentioned then regarding Babylon. It would be like a woman who is in labor pain. Someone read Galatians 4 and verse 19. Galatians 4 and verse 19.
My little children, of whom I travail in birth again until Christ be formed in you.
Okay, I travail in birth until Christ be formed in you. Paul was in, I hate to use the phrase labor pains, but that's what he's talking about, is the pains that would be associated with labor. Until Christ was formed in the Galatians. They should have, in dealing with the Galatians now, they should have been developed and formed to such an extent that that phrase should have been unnecessary. Remember in chapter 1, he says, I marvel that you're so soon removed from the grace of Christ into another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. They had obeyed the gospel, and now they were departed. They had departed because of false teachers. The false teachers specifically that he's dealing with in Galatians is the Judaizing teachers. Those who made the claim that Gentile Christians had to keep the law of Moses and they had to be circumcised in order to be a Christian. And Paul is writing to combat that, and in that, in chapter 4 and verse 19, he's in pain for them until Christ be formed in them. Christ had not been formed in them. He should have been. And they had had time for that to develop, but they didn't develop as they should. Instead, they were carried off into false doctrine and false ideas. Turn over to 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 3. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. So here, again, this same figure is being used. Peace and safety. Now a lot of times we hear that, don't we? Especially from a spiritual standpoint, when in reality it's not so. But sudden destruction comes upon them instead. So it is a figure that is used often in the scriptures. This idea of a in pain likened to a woman in labor. It was so agonizing in relationship to Isaiah that he was bowed down and he could not hear or see. Bowed down at the hearing of it. I was dismayed at the seeing of it. The hearing, the seeing of this catastrophe made him bow down in pain. Have you ever seen someone who just, no, don't tell me, I don't want to. They close their eyes and they close their ears because it just so bad they don't want to hear it. Don't want to know anything about it. That's the idea that Isaiah is saying here in relationship to Babylon and in Babylon's destruction. That's when it's very frightful, when it's in your own congregation. That you're overseeing and that you have the care for, and that you as an elder are going to give an account for them. And to hear things that some members are doing, then yeah, you kind of like that. Just don't want to hear it. And you want to do the scriptural thing and take a 2x4 to them and beat them half to death with it, and then get their attention so you can teach them a little bit. Well, that's what you'd like to do with some people. Isn't that right, Paul? Of course, you have the problems in the church as well, but what takes place in the world, it's going to soon take place in the church. What takes place in the church is going to, before long, affect the congregation that you're overseeing. I had just a fact of life, the way things work. I don't care what subject you're talking about, that's going to take place. And so, you pick the subject, and that will take place, that will happen. And so there's the need for eternal vigilance along that line. But it is something that is very worrisome for an elder, because he's the one who's responsible for it, ultimately speaking. We'll stop there and begin at verse 4 then, Lord willing, next week.